This is Nigel Forster from Creative Photography Experience. I'm going to give you a short presentation on how I use natural light in landscape photography. You'll see a range of examples, all using my own photographs, and I'll cover how natural light is produced, how you use it and control it in the camera, and I'll show you a range of finished results. Hopefully cover this in about the 20 minutes allocated. Um, just a brief introduction to photographing with natural light. The weather, as you'll expect, is a key and critical element of using natural light in landscape photography. Dramatic light, which is my favorite kind of light, is something I'm really going to concentrate on. An overview of probably the most popular amongst photographers light for photographing our landscape between what we call the golden hour, which is before sunset or after sunrise, to the blue hour, which is just before or just after, the other way around, if you like. Particular specific lighting opportunities which you might come across and take advantage of, difficult lighting, and a few top tips for photographing with natural light. So as I say with a lot of my presentations, I do a number of these. When working with natural light, a lot of your best favorite images are going to be caught purely by chance. So the secret is to be out there with your camera as opposed to pre-planning a picture, but obviously making advantage or giving yourself the maximum opportunity to take advantage of opportunities. So light, the weather and the seasons is where I'm going to start. So three particular aspects to this: the type of weather, clearly, and I'm going to cover that. I'm going to go into that in a little bit more detail. The time of day and the time of year also affects on how the quality of light changes throughout the year. My favorite kind of light, summarized in this picture: dramatic light, backlit from behind, lighting up a part of the landscape. So a bit of an overview there. The fact is, whether our light is inextricably linked to weather conditions, and it really can transform a landscape into something that you might not give a second glance to something that you'll have an image which you'll really look forward to seeing again and again. So cyclonic weather and low pressure, changeable weather. So typically southwesterly wind in the UK. This tends to produce probably my favorite kind of weather. It's dramatic, dark clouds, constantly changing light, that light and shade effect. So it's a kind of weather to look out for. So low pressure systems, fast moving air, which means it's windy, often windy, but you'll also get rapidly changing light within that. And you'll see these kind of pictures: dark, dramatic skies, bold, strong colors, great for changing light and backlighting, but also things like waterfalls, where perhaps you want an overcast day because you don't want any interference with light and shade, the light and shade effect. Anticyclonic weather, the more settled weather, bright sunny days, but can to be typically reflected in misty mornings, perhaps. Still air, which means reflections in water. So it does have its advantages as well. And in perhaps more reliable weather in some ways, you more often have got a pretty good idea what you're going to get. So misty landscapes in the morning, perhaps, but often fading into a rather hazy nothingness quite quickly. So if I was going to generalize and summarize this, in changeable low pressure cyclonic weather, often you can shoot all day. More typically, in more settled weather like this, you'll probably find that your shooting opportunity is around the beginning or the end of the day, most typically, because that's when you get the color effects and the more interesting light effects, which can turn rather flat during the day. Of course, anything to do with photography, like anything to do with photography, this is a generalization. So perfect reflections, frosty mornings during the winter, very cold air, and the light and shade effect. So the image at the bottom with a line of trees, backlit, the sun comes out, you're excluding the sky, so you don't worry about whether you get a blue sky or anything like that. You're just taking advantage of the light effect on the landscape. An overview of the different coloring and type of light you get during the seasons. Very blue, clear winter light, summarized in this range of pictures here. Hopefully the illustrations you'll see are more or less self-explanatory. Spring light, but very bright, bold, clear colors as well. Very bold, clear light. It almost reflects the kind of light you get in spring. So the two tend to reflect and match each other. Summer, a bit more hazy, isn't it? You haven't really got the clarity and quality of light that you tend to get during other times of the year. Summer, again, a generalization, is perhaps a time of year that I tend to take less pictures, partly as well because sunrise and sunset, they're kind of the ends of the day when you'll probably more typically shoot, are of course in the more extreme ends of the day as well. Autumn light, you can see again the change in the color, but it reintroduces the quality back into the light as well. You get that clarity back. In fact, this time of year, mid-September, really is about the time of year when I typically start shooting again. Although, of course, we had a very nice clear August as well, for at least for photography. So, changing light, as I mentioned, it's the kind of light I make most use of. It's got drama, it's got mood, it's got all those things I tend to look for in a landscape photograph. That image there, taken in Abruzzo in Italy. Interestingly, actually, that was taken in January. We tend not to get that kind of light in the UK. Probably another dimension I should add is that the light is different in different countries in the world as well. But the clarity and quality of this light is something we tend not to get in the UK. Using a lighting direction, probably the one I use most, backlighting, creating mood, contrast in particularly. Just see the difference between lighting from the front towards the light and with the light behind you. There's a massive difference in the light quality. So I try and take full advantage of that. So in anticyclonic weather, which produces this kind of dramatic light, often shooting against the light, sun behind cloud, perhaps coming out from between cloud. You'll often need to expose the highlights. You've got to be careful you don't overexpose highlights. Very often need to use a graduated filter to balance the exposure, because typically the exposure for the land is much less than the exposure for the sky. So typically you can overexpose the sky very, very easily. So autumn, spring, winter light, most typically I'll be shooting this kind of photograph. Oblique lighting or side lighting, which is another favorite kind of lighting of mine. Now, if I was going to summarize the kind of lighting I tend to go for, it usually is lighting facing in whatever direction I'm facing, in at least the half of the sky that I'm facing. So oblique lighting is great also because it reveals the landscape in all its detail. So you can see all the textures, all the forms, whereas backlighting tends to create light and shadow, light and dark. This one reveals all the textures in the landscape. So it's quite a common, popular landscape. Also very popular for things like people like tourism agencies, because they love this kind of view of the landscape that it creates with all its detail. Front lighting is another kind of lighting, effectively the sun in the direction behind you. Tends to produce flatter light, tends not to be so dramatic, and not, from my point of view, not one I tend to use as much. But rainbows, good example. You can get quite nice high contrast pictures as well, with just perhaps spotlighting on a particular subject. But this can also be quite a good lighting direction. But again, for me, not one that I tend to use too often. Lighting from above, what we call crepuscular rays. Rays from the sun, effectively, where the sun needs elevation. So you're looking at light coming down to the landscape from above, lighting perhaps part of the landscape, creating real drama. Very similar in some ways to backlighting, of course, because you're still shooting against the light by and large, but it's lighting up part of the landscape. So this is more about lighting direction from above. This is just an overview of a series of images where, in changing light, where the light, sunshine comes and goes. You don't quite know how it's going to work out, but it lights up a part of the landscape. You can see the first one, it's before the lights arrived. The middle one, the optimum moment, really, I think, where you've got the middle part of the landscape, or the back of the background lit, the foreground's in shadow, and the one at the bottom where everything's lit. So again, it tends to look quite flat. So I tend to go for light which creates the greatest contrast, typically foreground in shadow, not always, but typically, and draws the eye into the picture. This is, by the way, a panoramic. And in a panoramic, you've got to make sure the light's pretty consistent throughout the image, because otherwise it doesn't work effectively. This is just another example of using oblique lighting or light from the side, just showing how it can hit certain parts of the landscape. I was looking for the light to hit the mill. This is taken in Snowdonia. Hit and miss this. You either get it or you don't. But usually in changing light, the cloud's moving quickly. Often you'll normally, if you hang around long enough, normally something will happen. So this is just a series of examples where a couple of examples were just off the light direction I wanted. And finally, the one on the bottom right was exactly the place I wanted, the light to be hitting the mill, but no other part of the landscape. This is where I'm using light for visual separation. So I'm using either from above, top example, or from the side, the bottom example, to separate various parts of the landscape out. Now, lighting, either on a flat day or perhaps the direction behind me, wouldn't create that visual separation I'm looking for, which tends to create much more interest. So you can use either of these. Again, a bit hit and miss, particularly the lighting from the back. You don't quite know what's going to happen with it, but a great range of opportunity you normally get out of that kind of shot. Another way you can achieve visual separation as well is to use lighting in perhaps on a misty day or a hazy day, most typically at dawn, where you get this receding planes look, where the darker planes are close to the camera, and as you go more into the distance, then they lighten. So you get that stacking effect of dark leading to the lighter planes in the background. It also leads to unified colors as well, because the color at that time of day has a very strong bias, single color bias. So it brings the image together in a single color hue or emphasis. You can also use backlighting for this as well. You can see in the example on the top left how the backlighting effect has separated the planes of the landscape out as well. These are a couple of examples, one mountain, one industrial, where I've used a very dark, stormy sky, but light coming from the side to pick out parts of the picture in great contrast with the rest of it. Possibly the most popular light for landscape photographers is the golden hour to the blue hour, that changing light time, just after sunrise, just before sunrise, just before sunset, or after sunset, that period between. It's quite flexible, but it's that kind of time of day when you get rapidly changing, particularly light intensity, light color, long shadows, that kind of thing. And it can vary a lot in color, from a very blue effect, a very orange effect, almost a reddish effect, and of course sometimes on a grey day, a very grey effect, as in the example of St. Paul's, obviously very unpredictable as well. A couple of examples here. If you're really lucky, you can get that really luminous, strong red light. The example at the top, taken on the Shropshire Hills. Most typically, it tends to be more orange, but if you're really lucky, as I said, that red glow, which can often get most typically in spring or autumn, the seasons of change, where you get absolute light clarity in terms of light quality. It's the most commonly during that time of year, but as I mentioned, very unpredictable, and take advantage if you get it. The question is just being out there really and seeing what happens. It can be difficult to forecast this one. Most typically the orange effect, the backlit snow picture at the bottom taken on the Isle of Skye. These are just a series of images taken in the sunflower fields in Rhossili and Gower, and you can see in the image on the top left, before the sunset, it's lighting up the lowish or medium height clouds. As the sun goes down, it starts to light up the high level clouds. This typically happens. So if you're looking for a light effect of stormy clouds, for example, they'll most typically have color before the sun goes down or after it comes up. The high level cirrus type clouds, more typically of settled weather, tend to be before the sun rises or after it sets. So you can in some ways gauge what kind of lighting effect you might achieve. You might also look for specific lighting conditions as well. So here we've got a couple of examples, both taken on the Isle of Skye. Very dramatic weather, one just a hailstorm, worked well in black and white. The other one where the landform itself has created the shafts of light effect. Most typically, this tends to be from the clouds in the sky, but in this one, it was the landform that created. This is a question really of just being there and taking opportunity, making the most of an opportunity when you see it, and really having the eye, I suppose, and the camera control to be able to take advantage of it. This one looked, on the face of it, very similar. The light hitting just the village, everything else being dark. But you can see the low, misty clouds, the dark clouds over the village on the bottom one makes it much more dramatic. So it could be sometimes these are a once in a lifetime opportunity which simply don't repeat. As I mentioned, really just a question of being out there with the camera. You might also use a cloudy, overcast day. Very good for strong colors. Polarizer can often help with this as well. So you can also use flat light days. You can also use days with no clouds. So you've got the effect of light from the sun. You can either have the sun in the picture or simply have the light effect from the sun. So these are a kind of good thing that that you can make use of on a clear day. Often dismissed by landscape photographers, but it does provide its own opportunities. You can also utilize or difficult lighting conditions, and very easy to get it wrong. So this one, very undulating landscape with difficult light, often in this case reflected in the water, quite difficult to control. So HDR is a good method here because you can use this to blend images from taking the highlights from one, the shadow areas in the other, or other images and blending them. A graduated filter is difficult to use in this situation because it's got a flat, an even line to it. You can also change position. So in this example, you can see that the light was reflected in the water, but I've cropped it out on the subsequent example, just got the receding planes effect. So I've taken the problem part of the image out of the frame. I also underexpose quite a lot deliberately to make sure I don't blow highlights. And what you can do is bring back the shadow areas in post-processing. So deliberate underexposure in the original image and shooting a RAW is a very useful way of doing it. Finally, 5 tips in working with dramatic light, which is a bit of a summary of what I've already covered, really. Learning about weather forecasting, just an overview of what the typically different kind of weather patterns and weather systems create and its effect on light on the landscape. And it is becoming very, very accurate here. So you can get a good example of the kind of weather that you can typically come across, but keep it flexible as well. Don't really have any preconceived ideas. Secret, as I mentioned before, is to be out with your camera. Buying a high quality square filter system, essential really, particularly with a graduated filter example here, because of that contrast of light. There are, as I mentioned, other ways around it, using HDR, blending images, that kind of thing. But nearly all landscape photographers do have a filter system that broadens their scope for a different kind of image. Processing, post-processing has also got a role. Making sure you've got the data within the original image and being able to draw it out in post-processing is a critical part of the process. Whether you're vignetting, whether you're pulling back highlights, whether you're increasing shadow areas, whether you're darkening foreground, all those kind of things enhance the effect that you're trying to create. Hand holding is equally important. Flexibility of movement, speed of movement, ability to change location very quickly, act quickly in changing light is critical to getting the right pictures. So often setting up a tripod is a slow process, and you'll miss opportunities if you do it. And many of the lighting opportunities you'll experience will enable you to take the pictures handheld. An overview of backlighting and how to take advantage of backlighting on a cloudless day or just using the light effect, as I mentioned before. So hopefully 5 reasonably useful tips there. So a bit of a summary there, and I always finish my presentations with come on a creative photography experience workshop, and of course within the virtual show, do come and visit my my virtual stand. I hope you found this presentation useful, and those are my contact details at the end, should you wish to contact me and perhaps hear more about these presentations as well. Thanks very much for listening. Goodbye.